Hello there. Good evening. No, it's only two of us in here, so we're going to be lively. Hello there. How are you? Yes, you got to be excited. Help us out up here, okay? It's more of us up here than it is out there, but no worries. We're going to have a really good time. Thank you for coming. This is a very, very special broadcast edition of Hampton Roads Voices. Super excited about it because if you're an avid listener, and I'm not going to embarrass myself and ask how many of you listen, but I'm sure you do. If you are an avid listener, you know that we do this program every Friday evening from 5 to 7 p.m., and we talk about a variety of different topics, and they are super, super fun. And we also open up the phone lines to Hampton Roads and beyond, and you all definitely call in and make your opinions known and kind of shake the table. That's my favorite thing of our callers to do. So we talk about, we talked about the Colin Kaepernick controversy. We talked about how to go vegan. We talked about tax season. We talk about a lot of different things that help you and to get you to think and get you to converse and, get you to act, okay? So today is no different. Today's episode is entitled War on Drugs, Who's Winning? And if you're asking if I did this on purpose, if I put it on 420 on purpose, I did not. But it was brought to my attention. I was like, oh, okay, how appropriate. So today's conversation, it's gonna be very interesting because it's not gonna be one-dimensional. It's gonna be 30-dimensional, if you ask me. But we do have 4 different subtopics that we'll be diving into, including but not limited to, first of all, the opioid crisis. That is the current epidemic that we are in. If you hear about it but really don't know too much about it, like myself before I started doing research of this show, then you will definitely know a little bit more after leaving here. And then also we're going to be diving into the social justice part of things with the opioid crisis versus the crack epidemic, and how the opioid crisis is being confronted now and how the crack epidemic was being confronted. And then we'll take a look at the political side of things, decriminalizing marijuana. Should we do it? Should we not do it? The reasons why we should, the reasons why we shouldn't. And then we'll try to wrap this thing on up with treating drug addiction or treating drug abuse. So if you know anybody, if you are secretly dealing with that, then we will give you some information about that. And then, of course, we have special guest experts like we have every single week. But this time we have a packed house. I usually have around 2 to 4, but I have a lot today, and I'm going to go ahead and introduce them. And then they're going to pass around the mic and kind of tell you all their short stories. But we have 2 hours, so take your time, okay? So I'm going to introduce, firstly, he was one of the first special guest experts when the show came to be about, Dr. Robert Perkins. He is a Spartan here, chair of the Norfolk State University Sociology Department, and I like to call him a community activist because he's always out there getting his hands dirty, doing what he has to do. So hello there, Dr. Perkins.
Good evening.
You can go ahead and tell us a little bit about your social justice background.
Well, first of all, before I get to that, I want to say congratulations to WNSB for 30 years of programming. Yay. And you guys have been just an instrumental part of the community and getting our voices out there, and the work that you do is just measured to none other. As such, before I leave, where is Ms. Thorpe? Did she leave out? Before I leave today, I will be making my contribution to the annual campaign for WNSB.
Thank you.
I will continue to be a member and a proud member and a family of this unit, so you can keep inviting me back, okay?
Will do. Keep bringing money.
Yes, yes. But my background with substance abuse goes back to the 90s, and it actually came about very innocently. I was watching Arsenio Hall one evening, and Maxine Waters was on there, and she was talking about the fact that in her community, drugs were being planted in the Watts community of California by the government. And she had proof of it. And I thought to myself, no way this is possible. So I started to do my own research, and the more I learned about it, the more I found that there is credible evidence of such. So then the question became, why? That became a curiosity for me for the remainder of my career. And the more I learn about the epidemics of drugs and how it reach minority communities, the more concerned I've become. There could be an argument made that it was done for genocide. It could be an argument made that it was done to break up the black family. It could be an argument made that it was done to destroy certain communities because they weren't financially astute or whatever. But whatever the reason is, the evidence there that it was happening. So when I went into undergrad studies here at Norfolk State University, my senior project was based on the war of drugs. And I learned a lot more about it. What I learned at that point was, how did college students get access to so many drugs? And here again, it was the race component. Being here at HBCU, I understood that there was a disproportionate amount of students being impacted criminally for the war on drugs than at other surrounding institutions that were predominantly white institutions. I was astonished to find out that between the ages of 18 to 25, African Americans were 1 to 2.5% likely to use drugs, where their white counterparts were 5 to 10% likely to use drugs. So the question becomes, if those statistics are correct, in which they were, how were African Americans being disproportionately impacted criminally than their white counterparts? Because the statistics wasn't matching the outcome. And it continues today. You can see that evidence in the disproportionate amount of time given to those who possess crack versus cocaine. So what we have found in the sociological literature and research is that African Americans are disproportionately being impacted because they are under the microscope more than other communities. We're going to talk more about the opiate addiction and some other things, but I just want to point out that in our community in the city of Norfolk, the highest drugs that are impacting us is heroin, methamphetamine, marijuana, crack cocaine, and that's why I'm glad we have these experts here, because opiates is now taking over. Mm-hmm. When I lived in the state of Iowa, methamphetamines was the big drug. But the government was so proactive in saving their citizens in that state that they made it mandatory that you register to even buy medicine, because they were concerned that you were going to use medication in order to get the methamphetamine and build it, blah, blah, blah. And for those of you who do not know, some of the ingredients in methamphetamine is embalming fluid and motor oil.
Wow.
Yes. So people were mixing this up and putting it into their body, what caused a lot of problems with their digestive system, of course, but the big problem was lungs. So, but what it made me think about was, the government was so proactive in saving the bodies of Iowans, but yet even more proactive to destroy black communities.
And we'll leave a ... right there.
I will.
We'll get into that a little bit later. And then our next special guest expert for today on the panel is Delegate Stephen Heretic. He represents the 79th District in the Virginia House of Delegates, and parts of Norfolk and Portsmouth are under his district. Hello there, Delegate. Thank you for being here.
Hi, and thank you for having me.
Yes.
Let me just tell you a little bit of how I come to this conversation, because I think it's a little different. I currently sit in the Virginia House of Delegates. I represent the western edge of Norfolk. I have everything from the Navy base all the way down Hampton Boulevard to West Ghent. I have ODU, the ports. I have the northern half of Portsmouth. Prior to this gig, I was a city councilman in Portsmouth for about 8 years. So, I've seen some of the struggles that, our inner urban cities have, with drugs. But let me just take you back for a while. Back when I was coming out of college, I had the weird opportunity to do a dual doctoral program between Villanova Law School and Hahnemann Medical School in Philadelphia. And my first, actually, week in medical school, I was assigned to a clinical rotation in a street clinic in North Philadelphia that dealt with an addictive population. And it was, from a boy from a small southern town, it was a really different type of experience for me. And, the drug problems in those days, and we're talking the mid-'80s, were a little bit different than they are now, but I think that the types of, the folks who suffer from addiction are very much the same. After that, I finished medical school, finished law school, worked to clerk for a federal judge in Philadelphia. I saw drug cases from the inside, from the judge's perspective, and we saw a lot of folks going to federal prison for drug offenses. I came out. I worked as an attorney in the U.S. Department of Justice. I was in the criminal division for a while, and I did that enforcement. Coming out, I came back to Virginia. Governor Warner appointed me to the Virginia Board of Medicine. And I served about 12 years, was president of the Board of Medicine for a few years. And we dealt with, opiate overprescribing with docs all over Virginia. We took a lot of licenses from a lot of doctors who thought that prescription pad was basically legalized drug dealing. Fast forward, I participate on a healthcare foundation where we try to educate every opiate prescriber in the United States about what is and what is not applicable practice. And now as a member of the General Assembly, as you know, I've introduced a number of legislative measures to decriminalize and to legalize marijuana, among other things. And I think to make, what I consider to be basically a public health issue a little bit easier to deal with for the people who have addiction and the people who struggle with addiction every day. I think for many, many years in this country, I think it was under President Nixon that we began to hear about the war on drugs. And for a very, very long time, we began to see I saw like almost 80 cents of every law enforcement dollar spent on drugs, to the exclusion of every other criminal problem that we had. But I think over time we begin to see that addiction is a public health crisis, and I think that we in the legislature and the government probably a little slow on the uptake in dealing with some of these things. But I do think that we have to really refocus and reorient ourselves in terms of how we deal with these problems and how we use our resources in addressing them. Because we can put people in jail. It's easy, it's not terribly cheap, but that takes away a lot of lives. Not just the people who were there, but the people who are their families, the people who surround them. I think that as we go forward and as we begin to understand a little bit more about what addiction really is, that we have to look at different ways to adapt to that. We have to look at treatment instead of incarceration. And those are the types of things I've been working on with some of my colleagues in the General Assembly. I think we'll probably talk about that a little bit more later.
Definitely.
But I know you got a few more introductions,
Yes.
so I'll give it back.
Thank you. And moving forward, if you can keep your intros 30 seconds, that would be perfect. No worries. Next, we have Investigator Dan Love. He is from the Narcotics Department of the Norfolk Police Department. Hello there, Investigator Love.
Hello, thank you very much for having me.
Thank you for being
I will
here.
definitely keep it to 30 seconds. As you said, I'm an investigator with the Norfolk Police Department. I've been a police officer for a little over 20 years, and I've been assigned to the Vice and Narcotics Unit for just over 12 years. Since about 2014, I have specialized in diversion investigations. Diversion is just a kind of a law enforcement term to talk about legal medications that have been diverted for an illegal purpose. So either sold on the street illegally or forged prescriptions or things of that nature. And I'm currently assigned to a federal task force with the Drug Enforcement Administration.
Cool beans. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Receipts, accolades. Next, we're going to have Dr. Lawrence M. Ross. He is the Clinical Director of Substance Abuse, Mental Health, and Behavioral Health Services with the GHR Center for Addiction Recovery and Treatment. Please keep the mic here because we are broadcasting live over the radio. Hello there, doctor.
Hi. So I'm Larry Ross. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist. I've been in private practice for about 30 years. And then just recently, over the last year or so, there's been a very big outcry with regard to the opioid epidemic. And as a result, myself and a couple of colleagues, Dr. Hill, who's a psychiatrist, and Dr. Germano, who is an internist, we have decided to open the GHR Center for Addiction Recovery and Treatment. And so we are offering treatment not only for opioids, but for crack cocaine, alcoholism, and any other addictions. The thing that is important to know about, kind of going back to what Dr. Perkins said, is that things have changed to some extent. In the old days, it was very hard for people with Medicaid to access services, and now the services that we offer at GHR are actually free to Medicaid recipients from soup to nuts. Whatever treatment they need, substance abuse, mental health, psychiatric, medical, we're there to serve the community. And so thank you for letting me be here.
Thank you, Dr. Ross. Next, we have Dr. Marla Newby. She is the Norfolk Circuit Court Drug Court Coordinator. Hello there, Dr. Newby.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here.
I'm here representing Norfolk Drug Court. This is our 20th year in existence. And Norfolk Drug Court, if no one's been familiar with what we offer, it is a collaboration between the criminal justice system and treatment for addictions. I've been doing addiction counseling, believe it or not, 30 years. When I think about it, I can't believe it's been that long. But it's been quite a rewarding time to be a part of some of the growth. And I'm here to just contribute what we can do to help the community understand more, as well as, if you want to ask me any questions about the program, I'm here to answer those questions.
Perfect, thank you. And we also have special guests on our front row that I just want to have a special acknowledgement. Lieutenant Michelle Naughton. She's the Lieutenant of Vice Narcotics, Norfolk Police Department. Hello there, Lieutenant.
Hello, thank you for having us here.
Thank you for being here. That's all you got to say?
Oh, I didn't think I got the 30 seconds.
You
as
can,
well.
you do.
I'm currently assigned to Vice Narcotics, and I am a part of the drug court team with Dr. Newby. Just like they've said on the panel, it's not all about incarceration, and we are trying to find other ways to help folks who are suffering from addiction other than just incarceration.
Perfect, thank you. And we also have Corporal William Pickering. He is the Public Information Officer for Norfolk Police Department, Hello there.
Hello, everybody. I'm Corporal William Pickering with the Norfolk Police Department. I've been on the police department now for approximately 13 years. I have experiences basing in the Field Operations Division in the Detective Division, where I served as a investigator, violent crimes, homicide, robbery. Moved into the Criminal Intelligence Unit, and now I'm in the Public Information Office, and I'm just so happy to be here, and I appreciate you guys allowing us to participate.
Thank you for being here. All right, and of course we have you, Hampton Roads. I say that every single week, but if you are listening in the car, that's too bad because you should have been here. We are not accepting calls on today. However, we are accepting your thoughts out in the audience. So this is a living room conversation. We're going to talk, okay? So if you have something to say, if you have something to agree with, disagree with, respectfully, you can just put your hand up and we'll have Aaron over here pass you the mic. And if you can quickly tell him, because this is our way of screening, if you ever called into the show, we screen those calls because people call in and say all kinds of things. So if you want to whisper in his ear, I'm going to talk about this. Now, don't be up there talking, for a long time. You could just kind of, give him 2 to 3 words of what you want to talk about, wrap it up, and then he'll give you the mic. He'll let me know that you have something to say. If you can say your name, yeah, and then that's it. The city where you're from if you want, and then your thoughts, that'll be great. Direct it to anybody or just throw it out there, okay? So don't be shy, all 12 of us, all right? So we're going to go ahead and, I didn't even introduce myself. My name is Kiara Kilo Johnson. I do a lot of things at the station, but one of the 2 things that I do, I'm an on-air personality from 6 to 10 a.m. Monday through Thursday. And then Friday, I don't do the morning show because I do Hampton Roads Voices. I serve as the host and also the producer, public affairs program producer. Okay? Hi. Okay, so first things first, we're going to get educated and get informed about the opioid crisis. It is a state of emergency, and we want to know what exactly it is. So if you can tell us what an opioid is and what are the effects physically, mentally, what does it do? Dr. Ross?
An opioid is a drug that affects the central nervous system. And it produces effects of euphoria as well as pain reduction. So part of the opioid crisis is because physicians in the 90s were told that opioids were very safe drugs. Physicians were told that opioids were very safe drugs, and they started to prescribe them, and they prescribed them more and more and more and more. Until it became an epidemic. That's one half of it. The other half of it is heroin and other drugs that are on the street, also part of the opioid epidemic. And now what has happened is, because physicians are now being educated that opioids are problematic, the number of prescriptions that they are writing is drastically reduced. So people are, however, people are addicted, and so what happens if they can't get it from the doctor? They give it to they go to the street and they get heroin off the street. And the reason why this has become an epidemic is because the heroin is now, what is added to the heroin is fentanyl. Fentanyl is about 50 times more powerful than heroin. And carfentanil, which is another synthetic opioid, which is, believe it or not, 4,000 times more powerful than heroin. 4,000 times more powerful than heroin.
Wow.
And as a result of that, people that think that they're shooting up heroin are shooting up heroin with a kick, the fentanyl or the carfentanil. Carfentanil is an elephant tranquilizer and a tranquilizer for horses. That's how powerful it is. And that's why people are dying right and left, because this is being added to the heroin on the street. And now police officers are asked to carry something called Narcan. And what Narcan, because what the heroin does is that it suppresses the respiratory system and results in respiratory arrest, so people die. What Narcan does, what the police officers are asked to do, is to carry the Narcan, which reverses the effect of the respiratory suppression and brings people back. Not only police officers, but medical doctors can prescribe Narcan, and now pharmacists can also give Narcan for people. So these are some of the ways that the epidemic is being fought.
Okay, so if a person is high on an opioid, like the one that you were talking about, how are they acting? I'm just curious. Is there a particular way that they're acting? Because we know how people act when they're high on marijuana, how they're high on crack, but this opioid that you're referring to, how would they act?
Well, I think that people act differently depending upon their personality.
Okay.
I mean, some people are mellow, some people are more agitated. It just depends on the person's personality and also how much they're using.
Okay, all right. And I do want to let everyone know that in October 2017, President Donald Trump declared the opioid epidemic a public health emergency. And a little bit before that, almost a year before November 2016, our then Governor, Terry McAuliffe, announced that our then State Health Commissioner, Dr. Marissa J. Levine, declared the Virginia opioid addiction crisis a public health emergency. Does anyone know if we're still under that? Okay, it's still, okay, good to know. So how are prescription opioids and heroin linked? You kind of said that already, but tell us how they are different and how they are alike. One more time for me, please, a little bit more in depth.
Well, the way that they're linked is that they're both opioids.
Okay.
They both have this central nervous system effect. They all produce euphoria and decrease pain, but people become addicted. So, for instance, when I was in the Philippines a few years ago, I broke my ankle on Mount Tal, which is a volcano. I broke my ankle in 2 places, and so I came back to the United States, and I had a very good surgeon who did a great job. When I got out of the hospital, he prescribed 100 oxycodone, two pills 3 times a day. So if I did not take that prescription like that, I took it very, very sparingly, because if I had a predisposition towards opioid addiction, I would have become addicted based on that amount of medicine. Now, you know, to speak on the doctor's behalf, I think that many doctors until recently were not aware of how bad the epidemic is and what has caused this problem. But now doctors are being educated more and more. Emergency room doctors are being educated more and more. And, but that is how they are linked.
Okay, all righty. Solutions, what do we think can be done? And I'm gonna throw this question out to our audience because it's time to start shaking tables, okay? So what do you think, audience, can be done as a remedy for the opioid crisis? If you have any ideas that you may have heard before that we need to continue, or new ideas, you can go ahead and raise your hand and get that question going. But I ask the panelists, what do you think needs to be done to kind of curve this epidemic and reel it on in?
One thing that we are participating in Norfolk Drug Court is Vivitrol treatment. The generic name is naltrexone. It is an opioid agonist, and it will block any kind of sensation you would get if you tried to use an opioid. We had been selected 2 years ago now, so we're in our second year, finishing up the second year, about to go into the third. And we were blessed to get some funding from the state, who has become much more involved. I'm sure the delegate can share about that. They've become much more involved in supporting all efforts to provide options for medicated assisted treatment. So that's a newer one. Quite honestly, it is more expensive than Suboxone or methadone, but it also has some very positive results for people who have been struggling with the opioid addiction for many, many years. So far, we are pleased with our results that we see.
Thank you, Dr. Newby. So we're going to be consistent in how we do our radio programming. We're going to take a musical break, 2 songs, and then when we return, we're going to talk about the social injustice. Time to get things popping, to say the least. All right? We'll be back. It's Hot 91, Hampton Roads Voices. All right, thanks for your patience. Hot 91, your choice for hip-hop and R&B soul. It is Hampton Roads Voices, a very, very special broadcast on today entitled War on Drugs, Who's Winning? And we're talking about just that, war on drugs, everything having to do with that, from the opioid crisis going on right now, to the crack epidemic that happened before, to treatments, to how you feel about it, and decriminalizing marijuana, everything. Okay, so we're not taking phone calls on today, of course, but we are taking questions from our audience, and I do believe that we have a statement or an opinion or from Tressa. Hi, Tressa.
Hi, how y'all doing?
Good, thank you.
Good. So my name is Tressa Hundley. I'm from Portsmouth, and basically I'm alum here at Norfolk State, and I really wanted to find out with the opioid crisis that's going on. Since we have a prescription drug, if the doctor prescribes us a drug, of something more so like the oxycodone or Contin type of drug, what do you do with the remaining ones if you're not using them anymore once you find out that those are too strong for you, or you really don't need them anymore? And I also have a follow-up question after that too.
All right, we have the investigator. You can bring, okay, or you can have.
I'll get it right here. Hi, Tressa. So if you have medication that you are no longer in need of, you have a couple different options. Specifically with the opioids, what we like to have you do is either bring it to one of the drug take-back programs that we have in the city of Norfolk in conjunction with the Drug Enforcement Administration. We actually have one coming up next Saturday, I believe it's the 28th, and you can take it to any of the 3 Norfolk police precincts. But if you don't want to wait until those come around, they come around about every 6 months, you can go down to our Property and Evidence Unit, which is located downtown at the City Hall building. It's at 811 East City Hall. Anytime during normal business hours, you could just bring them in. We have a drop box. It looks like a mailbox. You can just throw those pills right in there, and then we will dispose of them, so you don't have to worry about it. For non-controlled substances, so like if you have a bunch of pills in your medicine cabinet that you just want to get rid of, it's fine to throw those things in the trash. There's no reason to take any kind of special precautions, but what we do suggest you do is that you take off any type of identifying information that's on the prescription bottle, so your name and birth date and things like that, and then otherwise you can just throw them in the trash. But if for some reason you feel uncomfortable just throwing them in the trash, what the CDC will suggest you do is mix it with some sort of substance that would be unpleasant, like kitty litter or coffee grounds or something like that, and then just throw them away. We've had no reported incidents of anybody going through garbage looking for pills or anything of that nature.
All right.
So my follow-up question, I'm sorry, are the doctors that are prescribing these medications, are they being monitored with all of the prescriptions that they prescribe?
Yeah, if I can follow up. Yes, Virginia is one of the states that participates in what we call the physician monitoring program. And now, every script that's written for any patient is maintained on a central database that the Virginia State Police monitor, so that, for example, if you have a doctor who is writing extraordinary amounts of OxyContin, fentanyl, or whatever for patients, they get kind of looked at. And by the same token, you have a lot of patients who go doctor shopping. And quite often, you know, they go to 5 or 6 different doctors. None of them know about any of the others. So you're getting, you know, OxyContin from 1, OxyContin from 2, OxyContin from 3. And it helps us to identify those patients who are doctor shopping and scoring their drugs that way. You know, it's a highly secure system. You know, access is very, very limited. But I can tell you that, you know, especially for doctors like in emergency rooms, they might not have seen you before. You come in with a complaint, an injury, you know, my back hurts or something. You know, those doctors can go online very quickly and tell, you know, if you have a drug-seeking type of pattern, and they will deal with that accordingly. So yeah, I mean, it's a lot more closely monitored today than it was. And I can tell you, I think to some extent, we are a victim of our own success in that regard, because back in 2005, 2006, when you could get legitimate pharmaceuticals very easily from a lot of different places, you didn't see a lot of heroin use. But now that it's becoming very, very difficult to find a doctor who will simply prescribe anything you want, people who are addicted have to go to something else. And now street heroin has become prevalent again for exactly that reason.
It's kind of like a catch-22.
Also, to just follow up, the other thing that's happening now is that if there is a doctor who might be overprescribing, the insurance companies themselves are now cracking down on the amount of opioids that they're allowing, and pharmacies won't necessarily fill every prescription. So it's being monitored from multiple sides.
So trust, not only is it being monitored, it's being acted upon. So as I mentioned earlier, I'm part of a task force that works with the DEA. We have, in recent months, actually arrested multiple physicians. So before, as Dr. Ross was explaining, physicians tended to overprescribe just basically out of ignorance. But that isn't an excuse anymore. Doctors now know this is not legal. So through the prescription monitoring program and through undercover type operations, we're able to identify doctors that are basically just being drug dealers in white lab coats, and we are arresting them the same way we're going to arrest any other drug dealer. It's just a little more complicated, obviously, because the doctors have a legal right to prescribe, so we have to take extra steps. But so it's not just that it's only being monitored, it's being monitored and acted upon.
All right, so we want those audience questions to continue. We're going to go ahead and shift gears here to the social justice part. The opioid crisis versus the crack epidemic, okay? So I'm going to throw this question out to our audience, and you are more than welcome to go ahead and let Chris or Aaron know that you would like to answer. So do you think there is a difference between how the government approached the opioid crisis and how they approached the crack epidemic? Why or why not? Why or why not? Do you think there's a difference between how the government has approached the opioid crisis and the crack epidemic? Why or why not? And while we're getting those questions screened, I'm going to throw this question to our panelists. In what ways would you compare the opioid crisis of today and the crack epidemic of the late 80s, early 90s? How would you compare those two epidemics, and how would you say that they differ? And if we can hold that question for 1 second. I'm throwing that question to our panelists. So in what ways would you compare the opioid crisis of today and the crack epidemic crisis of the late 80s, early 90s, and how would they differ?
Well, I think the difference is more in the response to both of the addiction patterns. In the early 80s, the war on drugs really just started happening in terms of government intervention. It started in the 1970s under Nixon, And then under Reagan's administration, that's when they put forth $1 trillion, I believe, within 4 years to fight the war on drugs. But in order to fight the war on drugs, they had to create a narrative about the war on drugs. And that narrative was babies being born from crack mothers, and they crack babies and crack mothers and crack communities and this, that, and the other. And the more that they did that, the more stimulus they came from financial government and services as such. Here again, I think that was the beginning of the destruction of a community. So the response is different. But here's where I really want to go in terms of social justice.
Okay.
In terms of social justice, the opiate addiction seemed to have less of a stigma because it's used for pain. All drugs are used for pain since the beginning of time. And it's not pain that should be the justifiable reason to incarcerate people or to explain addiction differently. It's so fascinating to me when marginalized groups feel pain and they use substance to curb that pain, they're criminals. But when the dominant culture use substance abuse to curb pain, it's a disease. So the question becomes, why does my pain criminalize me and your pain calls for sympathy on the top levels of the government?
And can I ask this, or I'm just going to throw this out here, playing devil's advocate, and of course being right down the middle. Can we say that perhaps the government learned a lesson from the 80s, and now they're doing it differently here in the 2016, 2017?
Yes, we can say that, but there's no statistics, research to back it up.
Okay.
The research, we'll come right to you.
Okay.
Well, she's a biologist. I'm going to let her take. Were you going to respond to this, dog?
But first, we have an answer to the question that I threw at the audience. And I want to remind our listening audience that this is Hampton Roads Voices. We're doing a very special episode entitled War on Drugs, Who's Winning? And I know you heard the spot running all week long. You should be here. We're not taking phone calls, but we are taking in-studio questions. Okay, so I asked the audience, do you think there is a difference between how the government approached the opioid crisis and how they approached the crack epidemic? Why or why not? And we're going to go to our audience. Hello there. What is your name?
Hi, my name is Jaleisha, and I'm a sociology major here at NSU.
Woot woot, Spartans, behold. What's your question, comment, or concern?
My comment was piggybacking off of Dr. Perkins. It's treated differently because of who is impacted by it. You have soccer moms who are addicted to opiates, and we need to get them mental health. And you had a welfare queen that was on crack, and it was okay.
Anybody want to piggyback?
If I could just follow up.
Please.
Let's remember that when the U.S. Sentencing Commission was established, there were two very different standards of sentencing between those who were convicted of possession and dealing for powder cocaine and those who were convicted of possession and dealing of crack cocaine. Same basic substance, different populations, and vastly different treatment in the criminal justice system.
And in addition to that, when the war on drugs really got going in the 1980s, there was an uptick in all crimes of 28%. For drug arrests or anything connected to drugs, it was an uptick of 126%. So here again, they're criminalizing certain types of behavior. And that was the 126% uptick was in 1983.
All right, we do have a audience question, then we're going to come back to you, Dr. Ross, okay? What's your name, ma'am?
Hi, I'm Dr. Camelia Moses Okpodu, and I'm the director of the Intelligence Community Center, the DIA designated, Defense Intelligence Agency designated Center of Academic Excellence here at Norfolk State.
Hi, doctor. Nice to see you again.
Good to see you. Have a little different look now.
Yes, she was on the show for environmental racism we did back in February. It was awesome.
So I want to respond. I think Dr. Perkins, I 100% agree with you, but this is also something we have to consider. Policy dictates a lot of things, and the persons who are sitting and giving the information to those policymakers, which is our legislative persons, had a limited view. They have parfocal vision.
It's like looking through a microscope with one eye closed. So because none of us, meaning no one from HBCUs who knew our communities were sitting there, they got misinformation and used that to drive policy that was bad. It was bad policy. We thought there was a moral reason why people did drugs. And it's not until we realized, it's sort of like under the Reagan administration when it came to HIV/AIDS or to stem cells. That's a better representation. And when they realized stem cell research could be helpful to someone such as our former president, then their whole position changed because we had more information. So I say that because I'm going to do a shameless plug. We need to have our students prepared to go into these places and to get jobs so that we can become the persons that influence the policy. If you're not at the table, your conversation doesn't get heard. Same thing, women, we have the same kind of thing, the glass ceiling. Well, take your high heel and break it. That's how I do. Invite yourself to the table. In other words, we have to prepare this generation of students to be so they don't get erroneous information to make bad policy. And now when that policy realized, as you said, they learned something from it. However, I think there was still, it was bias, implicit bias. Your lack of exposure, your lack of understanding led you to a wrong idea. And I'm glad that someone's having a conversation going back to rectify the things that we did wrong. People spending 10 years in federal prison for a possession of crack cocaine and people getting a slap on the hand for having, as you said, sentencing guidelines that really were not parallel. So I think we need to be preparing ourselves. So if any of you young folk want to be prepared to go in these global places, that's what I do over in the Intelligence Community Center. There's 17 agencies, of which the Drug Enforcement Agency is one of them, as well as NSA and others. So come see, so we can put our students there. In fact, Norfolk State for 2 years was the #1 producer of students who got jobs in the IC.
Thank you, Doctor. We're going to take a quick pause to play our station ID.
Norfolk State University Broadcasting, WNSB, Norfolk, Chesapeake, 91.1 FM, and HD1, Virginia's only full-time urban public radio station, Hot 91.
But we are not done with the conversation. It is Hot 91, your choice for hip-hop and R&B soul. This is a very special broadcast of Hampton Roads Voices entitled War on Drugs, Who's Winning? And we're just getting started to heat things up. Dr. Ross, I believe you had something to say?
Yeah, I think another big part of the problem was one of the panelists mentioned that during the Nixon administration, how much money went into the, how much money was given? $1 trillion was given for drug enforcement. Out of that $1 trillion, probably 0.01% went into treatment. There was no money for treatment. The money was to lock up people who used or dealt drugs. And so that was a tragedy. One of the things I think we've learned now is that treatment is very important in terms of dealing with the war on drugs. And so now the arts program in this state, which is the Addiction Recovery Treatment Services, now is providing money for treatment. For Medicaid recipients, it's free. This is not only for the opioid crisis, it's free for people who are alcoholics, it's free for people who are addicted to crack, as long as they're Medicaid recipients, and if they're commercial insurance recipients, then it's much lower cost than it used to be. So now there's a recognition that the war on drugs is not only about locking people up, but it's also about treating people who are victims of this problem.
And that kind of goes back to if the question, can we say that is the government approaching this new drug epidemic differently? And I want to continue to encourage our audience to continue talking. So from this particular article that I found about doing research, is from How Stuff Works, and the article is entitled Opioids versus Crack, the Politics of Race and Addiction. A law professor at the Benjamin N. Cardozo School of Law at Yeshiva University, his name is Ikao Yanka, has something very, very interesting to say. He said that plenty of sociologists and economists were making these connections back in the 1980s, but their voices and data were drowned out by a media narrative that preferred to place the blame for the crack epidemic on negligent black mothers and absent black fathers. And so, I'm gonna let that sink in, and I'm gonna ask this question to you, audience, and also to our panelists. Do you believe there seems to be a different approach by the media outlets in the community? We've already talked about the government, so do you believe that there's a different approach by the media outlets and the community to the current opioid epidemic than there was one for the crack epidemic? Tell me how so. Tell me why do you think that is? And then I might have a follow-up question for you. Corporal?
Yes, ma'am. I'd like to comment on that. I think that a lot of that is the new narrative now when it comes to opioid addiction and treatment, and the programs, in particular with law enforcement and how we deal with that and interact with the community suffering from that addiction, is the social media. Social media has changed so much. It allows anybody with a phone, anybody with an outlet to express their experiences in dealing with this issue. With narcotic use or with opioid use. Even in law enforcement, the ability now to share information, just from our phone, receive information from other agencies in helping us do our job, keeping awareness, even for a law enforcement perspective, of what resources are available to us as police officers and what we can bring to the community that we serve that are suffering from these opiates. I think, again, with the social media, we have individuals out in the community that are able to share their experiences. We're able to see that as well as law enforcement officers. And I think that when the media outlets start to see the response from the community, when they share these heartfelt stories, that the media outlets are naturally going to go in that direction. They're going to want to cover the grief. And with that sharing of their experiences, it helps people become aware of the effects that it does have with the family and with that individual user as well. And then those that unfortunately succumb to that addiction, what resources are available to them, to get treatment. And that, as policemen, our job is enforcement. Our job is to enforce the law. But we are also aware that there are resources available for those people that are suffering from addiction, and we work hand in hand with those individuals so that we can help those people that are suffering.
Yeah, I would agree with social media, and I would agree that even news outlets, they don't even it seems that Twitter reports first before the news outlets. I always say, go ahead and get a mic, Dr. Perkins. I always say, before you even check the news outlets, log on to Twitter at 6 a.m. because I'm up at 6 o'clock to do the show, and I'm scrolling, and I see the news, and then our news outlets will be kind of late, and they kind of see what Twitter is talking about first. The social media accounts are talking about first. So that's an interesting take on that, Dr. Perkins.
I agree. That is an interesting take, and I agree with you 100%, Corporal. But in addition, what social media does, it removes the mask and the imaging from the news outlets and the government. When I worked in Iowa on these addiction problems, I remember going to Ottumwa, Iowa. And when I went there, they looked at me, and everybody just kept staring at me. And I finally asked the lady, I said, how many black people live here? And she said, well, right now, you're it.
Wow.
But when I was leaving out of Ottumwa, Iowa, there was this big board, and it said, help with addiction. And it had a black mother holding her black baby on the board. So the imaging indicates that drug problems was a black problem. Yet the treatment wasn't going to the black communities. It was going to those other communities. So what social media does is put out the real image, the real narrative, and refuses to allow those concrete images that have been instilled in our mind and stigmatized to be disillusioned. So that's why social media is so important. And Kilo, you probably remember the big hit. I forgot what they call them when things go viral. That went viral.
You showing your age,
I'm not a
Dr.
social
Perkins.
media guy. But where they had the couple that overdosed in their cars. And it was so fascinating because the information was out there first, and people thought there was a minority couple. And then when social media posted and they saw that it was a white couple, they were like, oh, that's not what we thought. And so half of the comments was, wow, That's not what we thought.
Wow. We do have an audience comment. What is your name, sir? Thank you for being here.
Thank you. My name is Kenneth Spencer. Unfortunately, you took half of what I was going to say.
Say it again, Mr. Spencer.
But I think that when you look at what happened in the 80s, you just had a few media outlets and they controlled the narrative. One of the things with the media was sensationalization, and that was a very big thing during that time period. So whether you look at what was on TV or you look at what was being presented in the news, it was always a sensationalized version. Now, as you said, you've got social media, so the networks no longer own that message. You have more people that are able to share what's going on and more people that are following that. Same thing on the side with law enforcement. You now have more knowledge and awareness with the police department, so they are now, instead of just, oh, let me go and address this from a criminal perspective, now we're looking at more issues that may influence the situation that we come in contact with.
Thank you, Mr. Spencer. All right, so we're gonna take a musical break. We're gonna play 2 songs, and when we return, we're gonna get into decriminalizing marijuana. Why should we do it, or why we should not do it? So keep it locked right here. It is Hampton Rose Voices. War on Drugs. Who's winning on Hot 91? Okay, Hot 91, your choice for hip hop and R&B. So Hampton Rose Voices is live right now, and we have a very special broadcast episode. And it's special because we have panelists here, and we're having a panelist discussion, unlike the ones that you're used to every Friday. Instead of having phone calls and our listeners call in to share their points and put their quote-unquote 2 cents in, we have the in-studio audience, and we're chatting it up with them. I do want to reintroduce my special guest panelists. I have Dr. Robert Perkins here. He is the chair of NSU's Sociology Department and a community activist. I have Delegate Stephen Heretic here. He is from the 79th District in the Virginia House of Delegates. Dr. Lawrence M. Ross is here. He's the clinical director of substance abuse, mental health, and behavioral health services with the GHR Center for Addiction Recovery and Treatment. And I also have Dr. Marla Newby here, Norfolk Circuit Court Drug Court Coordinator, and down at the end, Corporal William Pickering, the Public Information Officer for Norfolk Police Department. Okay, so we've talked about already what the opioid crisis is, the state of emergency for that. We talked about the opioid crisis versus the crack epidemic. That was very interesting. And now we're going to move on to marijuana here on this 420. This was not intentional, I say again. Okay, so we're gonna, I had one question. I had number 10 first, but I'm gonna go, panelists, I'm gonna go to number 12. All right, and I'm gonna read from Pilot Online. And this particular article was released early of this year. So Delegate Stephen Heretic, who we have here on the panel, he says now is the time to stop putting marijuana offenders behind bars. He cited several states legalizing and others decriminalizing. He says, quote, and this is according to the Pilot Online, quote, we've seen evolved societal norms. More people are accepting of marijuana. This is a bill whose time has come, end quote. So Delegate Heretic, you drafted this bill, HB 1063. And it was actually rejected by a panel of a House subcommittee earlier this year. Can you tell us a little bit more about that bill, why you drafted it, so forth and so on?
Well, I do think that criminal law really does need to.
No worries. And also, audience, I do want to encourage you to get your questions forming in your head, because we want to talk more with you, okay?
Going back, I do think that criminal laws do to some extent reflect societal norms. You know, there are 2 types of law that they teach us about in law school. There are acts which are called malum in se, that are acts which are evil in themselves, murder, rape, robbery, those types of things. There are other acts which are called malum prohibitum. They are wrong or evil because they are simply prohibited by society. Speeding, for example, you know, but who doesn't go, you know, 55, right?
I do that all the time.
Well, and I think that when you look back at the history of marijuana legislation, you see at the time marijuana laws first came into existence back around the 1920s, you know, there was a lot of hype about, you know, marijuana. And let's face it, back in those days, marijuana was predominantly used in urban areas by folks who don't necessarily look like me. Okay, so it was one of those urban types of drugs that the white community was a little scared of because, hey, we don't know what that is. So you saw movies like Reefer Madness, you saw these types of things evolve. And sooner rather than later, marijuana gets the same top billing on, the drug laws that you see with other types of drugs. I think as we've seen, societal norms evolve, particularly in the 70s and 80s, a lot more people use marijuana. It's a lot more societally pervasive. I would tell you that right now, if some of the more recent polls we have done show that over 80% of all Virginians, Republicans, Democrats, whites, black, everybody, favors at least decriminalization of possession for adults. A sizable percentage of that also favor legalization. Not quite the same thing. But I think when we look to other states, predominantly in the West, California, Oregon, Washington, Colorado, Massachusetts in the East now, the District of Columbia, we are not seeing, in those states that have decriminalized or even legalized marijuana use, we don't see the same sorts of, the sky is falling, death predictions that we have heard for so many years. Now, there are issues, obviously. And by the way, this is the third year that I've put in decriminalization bills. They get killed every year, but I can tell you that every year there's a little bit more thought put into it before they're voted down. And I can tell you that, this year, for the first time ever, a Republican-sponsored bill did pass allowing the prescribing of opiate or cannabinoid oil for treatment of certain medical disorders. Now, that doesn't sound like a lot, particularly when you're comparing that to like D.C. and Massachusetts, but for Virginia, that was a big move. And I think that in the discussions that I and my colleagues are having in the General Assembly, we know that the day is coming. Now, it's not here yet, and I'm not going to tell you it's going to be here tomorrow. But, the day is coming where we're looking at marijuana very differently. But by the same token, there are problems that we have to deal with, and we hear from a lot of our colleagues in law enforcement, well, if somebody's driving under the influence, well, if they're drinking, you know what that is. You can test for it. You can prosecute that. If you're driving while high, well, how do you figure that out? How do you test? And by the way, how do you keep people safe? Other drivers on the roads, that sort of thing. How do you keep people safe if you can't really detect it? So those are problems that we're having to work through. But I can tell you that I think right now, just about everybody that I know and everybody I talk to on both sides of the aisle, frankly, will tell you that, they look at marijuana very, very differently than opiates, for example. Marijuana will not kill you. Marijuana, might take you out of action for a couple of hours, but that's about it. I think it is an idea whose time has come. I can tell you as a former federal prosecutor, it's a little bit weird for somebody like me to be putting in the legislation, but I think that's a reflection of how far we've come in looking at this problem.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that. And we do have an audience comment. Hey girl, I like your hair. What's your name and what's your comment?
My name is Kristen Shepard. I am a sociology major here as well, and I am from Norfolk. So you asked the question, should marijuana be decriminalized? I'm sorry. And I stated that in a sense it should be decriminalized, but for those who use marijuana for medical use. But since it's not legalized, I feel like people should be held accountable for their actions. So could I have feedback on that comment?
So I just want to clear that up. So you're in favor of medical marijuana only being
Correct.
Decriminalized.
Correct.
Okay. So I'm glad you said that because I wanted to move on to the medical benefits of marijuana. First, she wants to know your feedback, and so do I. So before we get into that, I do want to know, panelists, and you are more than welcome to skip this, but I want to know your stance on the efforts to decriminalize and or legalize marijuana in the Commonwealth of Virginia. You can elaborate if you want to state your opinion on that. Dr. Newby. It's coming. There you go.
Okay. First, I want to make sure and say that my comments do not represent the beliefs of the Norfolk Drug Court, because I want to go to work on Monday.
Okay.
However, the concern certainly behind decriminalizing and or legalizing is it unfortunately gets marketed as free reign marijuana use. Just go and smoke as much marijuana as you like, and it appears to be no consequences. Marijuana has a substance in it called THC, and it is still addictive. And people are still coming to treatment, such as our program and many other substance abuse programs, for addiction to marijuana. And so that's the issue that unfortunately is still on the table. And it concerns me because people get misinformed, you know, no matter what the source is, but they get misinformed about what the real consequences are. And those are the real consequences. Should it be decriminalized? I do support that. Should it be legalized? I'm not there yet. That's my opinion.
Thank you, Dr. Newby. Dr. Ross, should it be decriminalized? Are you for it? What's your stance on the efforts?
Well, what I want to speak to primarily is the recent bill that was signed by Ralph Northam, allowing the use of medical marijuana here in the state of Virginia. And I think that that was a very big step forward, and I think it was a very necessary step. You know, there's again, coming back to the opioid epidemic, kind of linking these two things together. There's a large body of evidence that shows that the use of medical marijuana is very helpful in the treatment of opioid addiction, and as well as many other types of issues. So I think that it is very important that our society has become more enlightened over time and understand that there are medical uses to this. A lot of times the medical marijuana does not have the same THC content as the marijuana on the street. They specially breed it to reduce the THC content, but it does maintain the medical properties that can be used to help people.
And in a little bit, Dr. Ross, I want to know what those medicinal benefits are, what they treat, if you know that from the top of your head. So just be thinking about that. Dr. Perkins, what's your stance on these efforts?
I agree with the other panelists, and I thank you for your question and your position. And I agree that medical marijuana should be utilized. Every other drug has been utilized and overseen by the medical community, so why not this one? I also agree that it should be decriminalized but not legalized. I'm not nowhere near there, because all the research still points to the fact that marijuana is the #1 gateway drug to more devastating drugs and outcomes. If I may, Kilo, a lot of people don't know what we mean when we say decriminalize versus legalizing.
No, you may not. We're going to move into that in 2 seconds, Dr. Perkins. I do apologize. Did you want to pass, Corporal? Okay.
This answer is going to be easy for the police department. Our job is strictly to enforce the laws that are enacted by state and federal legislature. So whatever is done, whatever laws are enacted, as law enforcement, we are going to enforce those laws. So I can't care to comment on whether we should decriminalize or legalize.
Understandable. Thank you, Corporal. All right, so the medicinal benefits. We have heard, I know, Ms. Thorpe, our general manager, would like to say something. I'm sorry, Ms. Thorpe.
I have a question. It just amazes me how much money the states that have legalized it are making, the millions of dollars that they're making from legalizing marijuana. And I'm wondering if the state of Virginia has, when you all have your discussions, are you discussing that, you know, this could be a money-making venture for the state?
I can tell you that is not part of the conversation. You know, we don't look at marijuana or any other, thing like that as a potential source of tax revenue. I know that the states that have legalized marijuana or decriminalized it, do see some actually slight increases in tax revenue from that. But remember that it's still illegal under federal law. So the question becomes, how can you tax it? And by the way, you can't even put a lot of the money that you make off of the sale in banks. So it's not at all clear that it really does substantially enhance anybody's revenue, but it does, by the way, allow for a diversion of money, especially to law enforcement, to more productive law enforcement use. So instead of chasing, low-level marijuana dealers, the law enforcement officers, including those here, can spend their time a little bit more constructively, I would assert, chasing guys who are really bad. And I think among the law enforcement officers that I talk to, that's really what they would prefer to be doing anyway.
That's a
Well,
good.
let's not forget the other end of that as well. Illegal marijuana and illegal drugs is a money maker for the state. As a matter of fact, there are many, many careers and organizations and courts that are developed just for combating that. So the question always have to be, how many job losses would there be in the state of Virginia if you were to legalize it?
Shake the
So
table, Dr. Perkins.
you might get $1 million for legalizing it, but how much money is the state of Virginia getting for keeping it illegal?
All right, and just 2 snaps from the doctor. Just in case you are just now tuning in, this is a very special episode of Hampton Roads Voices, War on Drugs, Who's Winning? And we're having a really good discussion right now about decriminalizing and legalizing marijuana. Dr. Okpudu?
Okay, my name is Camille Okpodo. I'm actually a professor of biochemistry and plant biology. So my degree is in plant physiology. So I know a lot about this story because actually I used to work, full disclosure, this is my opinion, not any representation of the university. Okay, so I work here, but a long time ago I worked with R.J. Reynolds. So you think cotton is king. Remember that expression from the people from history? Well, tobacco is an emperor. And a lot what has happened, and I actually give a lecture on social injustice, how it took 10 years, because we're coming up on 1619, and when John Roth brought tobacco from the Trinidad, he realized that King James, which we are familiar with him because he helped translate the Bible from Latin so most of us can read it, but it was his pact that he wanted to actually have a place of making income. So tobacco, when John Roth figured out how to propagate tobacco in Virginia, from the time he brought it in 1609 to 1619, that's when the first slaves appeared in Jamestown, tobacco became protected because the king of King James wanted to make his cut on what was being made, and so that's why slavery stayed a real conundrum for the people in England. They got rid of it, but for here in the colonies, it was money making. So it protected it. Hemp. There are varieties of cannabis that does not make as much THC, and is a very good source of fiber that can be used for other things. But I know in North Carolina that that you couldn't go. Farmers wanted to grow hemp, and they said no, because tobacco is emperor. So we're still dealing with that. I am also of the mindset of there are a lot of things that can happen. It is medicinal, and it should be used for medicinal purposes. Students always tell me, oh, it occurs natural, so does aspirin. But go out and eat a whole lot of aspirins and tell me what happens to your liver. So there's consequences. It should be managed, it should be available. The cannabinoids are what we're talking about. So when you spoke to the fact, it's no different if you do the marijuana plant as you take in tobacco. They have some secondary metabolites, things that the plant makes in protection of itself that will hurt us. But there are properties in marijuana that we clearly need to look at. CDC is now beginning to realize the cannabinoids, you can isolate them very easily. And I tell students to be careful. We just talked about Prince when we were talking earlier about the opioids. He died unnecessarily. He got illegal drugs, and because the way it was cut, it ended up killing him. It's the same thing with marijuana. They're putting embalming fluid in that because the person who's selling it to you wants to keep you addicted. Because if you don't buy it, he or she doesn't have a way of supporting their income. So I just wanted to make sure that we realize that it's an environmental injustice that started this whole conversation. And tobacco for a long time has been protected. And so because it is protected at all costs, we forgot that marijuana has some medicinal properties that we should definitely buy. I'm nowhere near that it should be legal because we know that THC is very bad. We've known that. I often say to students, why does my generation all of a sudden want your generation to be able to get marijuana? Because it's a way for us to make money.
I love how different conversations can kind of all connect. She came from an environmental justice, and then we're talking the political side, the social justice side. Okay, so we're going to hit on 3 things before we go back on break, just to let you know in case anyone has questions, and we might answer your question here coming up. So we're about to hit on the medical benefits and what diseases and sicknesses marijuana best treats. We're going to talk about the difference between legalization and decriminalization. We've been throwing that around. What exactly does that mean? And then right before we wrap up, we're talking about if it were to be decriminalized and if it were to be legalized, how would that look in the near future for the Commonwealth as in regards to the healthcare field and things of that nature? So medicinal, Dr. Ross or anyone else who has something to say about that, can you tell us the benefits and the diseases and sicknesses that it cures or helps?
Sure. I also wanted to speak to your point about Prince. I think the reason why Prince died is because there was the most recent report is that there was fentanyl in the heroin he took, and he didn't realize the amount of fentanyl, and that's what killed him. So the fentanyl being put into the heroin makes it very, very deadly. Also, the fact that there is some arbitrariness in our society. You know, as you said, tobacco. We know tobacco causes cancer, right, among many other things, but it's legal. Alcohol, we know alcohol causes cirrhosis of the liver. It causes brain damage. It decreases it kills brain cells, which do not regenerate, and yet that is legal. So there is some arbitrariness in society in terms of what is considered legal and what is not legal, and a lot of it has to do with the money end of things. In terms of the medicinal properties of marijuana, well, what is marijuana? Marijuana basically is an analgesic. It's a pain reliever. It reduces pain. Similar to opioid, which also reduces pain. And so there's, as I said just a few minutes ago, there's a body of evidence that shows that marijuana, which is a much lesser drug than opioids, obviously, is very useful in the treatment of opioid addiction. Marijuana is, because it's an analgesic, I think that the bill signed by Ralph Northam allows it to treat other types of things, such as severe anxiety and things of that nature. And a very good report on the medicinal properties and the negative properties of marijuana was done by Dr. Sanjay Gupta about a year or so ago. And there are some things that only marijuana helps with. I don't remember the disease, but this one person would have these fits that could not be stopped. He'd have thousands of them per hour. Nothing helped him. He took he took a little bit of marijuana. Actually, it was from a cigarette marijuana joint, I guess. 2 hits, finished. It was no more problems. So I think we do need to put more money into the medical side of things to learn what types of things can help us and what types of things harm us, and not to have a preconceived bias about things.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Ross. All right, so legalization and decriminalization. And I want to remind our panelists, we have a good 17 minutes, and we still have to talk about treatment. So if we can try to hit the point. Not to say that nobody is hitting the point, but yeah. So what's the difference between legalizing and decriminalizing marijuana? Make it plain for us, delegate.
Simple as this. Decriminalizing marijuana does not make it legal. In other words, if an adult is caught with a basic amount of marijuana on his or her person, law enforcement, at least under the legislation that's been proposed by me and a number of my colleagues, you can get a ticket for that along the same lines as not wearing a seatbelt. You would pay an administrative fee, but it's not charged as a crime. It does not post as a crime on your record. It won't keep you from, prevent you from getting jobs in the future. It is not a criminal offense per se. Legalizing marijuana is a different thing entirely. Legalizing marijuana would mean that I can buy it. Under certain circumstances, I can sell it. A number of states have clinics or pharmacies, whatever, where if you're over 18 years of age, you go and show them an ID, and you can buy whatever you like. Take it with you. Virginia is a very long way from that situation.
I would imagine. So if I wanted to compare that to, say, alcohol, is alcohol absolutely legal or is it decriminalized? Because I can't walk on the street with my vodka, but I can buy it from the ABC store.
Alcohol is legal in Virginia, subject to certain restrictions. You can't drive under the influence, for example. You can buy it, you can possess it, you can consume it, but you can't consume it anywhere and everywhere that you want. Same thing with marijuana in many of those states. For example, like in Colorado, you cannot stand on the street and smoke a joint.
Gotcha.
You know, you have to do it in the privacy of your own home. You can't smoke it in a public place at all. And by the way, you will be arrested if you do. So while it's legal to possess and to use, there are certain circumstances wherein you cannot use marijuana, for example, standing on a street corner.
Perfect. So it's a long spectrum here. It's not just legal and unlegal. So thank you for breaking that down. And before we go on break, one last point we want to make. How would that look if we decriminalize it here in the Commonwealth, and knowing that it is the Commonwealth, we are kind of not near it, but we might not be that far away either. So how would that look if it is decriminalized in the near future in regards to us as citizens, our taxes, as Ms. Thorpe asked earlier, the healthcare field, how would that look? Criminal punishment, et cetera, policies, how would that look? Decriminalization and legalization here in Virginia. If you just want to kind of throw out what you think, of course, because we wouldn't know.
Let me take a stab at this before my colleagues get a shot. If you look at the states that have legalized marijuana, while there was a hue and cry over that process, once it's been legalized, you don't see a vastly different amount of use. You don't see a vastly different amount of abuse. It really hasn't changed a great deal. I think all it would do in Virginia, I mean, and I would say this to everybody listening, I think we all know people who smoke marijuana pretty much every day. Okay, it would simply take it out of the closet and eliminate the risk that it has to criminalize that behavior, ruin a career, lose a job, do those types of things. It takes that away. So it helps to minimize the social impact that is imposed upon marijuana use as an offense. I referred to it earlier as malum prohibitum, something that's not evil in itself, but it's evil because we have chosen to criminalize it. It takes that stigma away. Now, I know that there are studies out there, some will argue that it leads to additional addiction. I really don't think that more current studies prove that. A meta-analysis that was released by the University of Pennsylvania Medical School, I think, earlier this week, looking at longitudinally about 40 years worth of studies on marijuana, and frankly, they're not as many studies as one would hope, but showing that really the fears of cognitive impairment, memory loss, those types of things are a little exaggerated. And I would take, to some extent, an issue with what Dr. Perkins said earlier. I don't think there's really a lot of solid clinical literature that I've seen which really reflects that it really is a gateway drug, because a lot of people use marijuana that don't go on to anything else. So I don't know that it's, the predictions, the fears are really, once objectively, analyzed, are really as dire as we've, at least in my generation, we've grown up to believe.
Yeah, and I would agree among millennials and not Generation X, but who's before that, baby boomers? I'm not sure, but I'm gonna say you guys seem a little afraid of marijuana. Like, oh my gosh, you're doing that, you're gonna do heroin. And I've seen plenty of tweets that say, I just like weed, and this is what the tweets are saying, not Kilo. They're saying, I just like to smoke weed. I don't want to do heroin. I don't want to do crack. And they also say, if whoever used that as an excuse, that I started off with weed to go and do crack, you've been wanting to do crack. Don't use marijuana as an excuse to that. And that's just a tidbit from representing for the millennials. Dr. Perkins, you have something to say?
I said you're not representing for the millennials. Well, the reality is the fact that man has decided to legalize, decriminalize does not take away from the fact that the biology in the body has the same impact. So the social aspect does not run the biological, and the biological does not run the social aspect of it. So if marijuana was a gateway drug in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and 2000, trust me, it's going to be a gateway drug in 2018. So even if we are proponents of decriminalizing, which I am, that doesn't take away the reality of it. And whether you want to believe the studies or you don't want to believe the study, it's real. The only thing that's not real is people's opinions and the perspective. The opinions and perspectives are real, but they are not grounded in the research, they're not grounded in the literature, they're not grounded in anything other than lived experiences, which is very valuable. Now, going back to why I don't believe it should be legalized is because if you legalize it, I believe that we are saying kudos, go do it. My first career was in pretrial services with the city of Norfolk under the court system. And I worked as a drug counselor there. And those that were utilizing marijuana had a different perception of what addiction was and what usage was. And I'll give you an example. They'll come in my office and say, when is the last time you used? Oh, I haven't used in a long time. It's been a long time. Well, what's a long time? Oh, it's been at least 2 days. Well, they often say marijuana is a gateway drug. Do you use any other drugs? No, I don't use any other drugs. Have you ever tried cocaine? Well, yeah, that's just once a month, though. Have you ever tried heroin? Oh, that was a while. That was at least 6 months ago. The reality is that the reason why addictive patterns happen with drugs is because people keep chasing that first high. And when you get to a point that you can no longer feel that first high, you go a step higher to a different drug. Every research has shown it. None of them has said otherwise. So if we move forward with these legalized, decriminalized notions and incentives and evaluations and ideas and legislation, all I ask as a professor and as a black man in society that have seen communities being devoured by drugs, please be real about it.
Thank you, Dr. Perkins.
That's all.
And my producer, Will, is going off because I think we should do a whole show about decriminalizing or legalizing marijuana. That would be great. If you can keep your comment under 20 seconds, we have at least 9 minutes left. And then, Mr. Lateef, you can say what you have to say if you keep it short. Dr. Newby?
Certainly, I'm not going to repeat what Dr. Perkins added, and it's very, very valid. The only thing I want to add to that is the issue that occurs with marijuana as well as any other drug is that the person who is using this substance, number one, is taking the risk as to what they expect to get out of the euphoria from that substance. And most people don't understand you're actually taking a risk. Now, is it similar to some other risks that we take with all of the medications we see advertised on TV that give you that fast version of your arms are going to fall off and you may go blind? And sure, some of those risks are similar. However, we're talking about mood-altering substances that change the brain. And so it is very, very important to understand that there's a lot of validity behind marijuana being a gateway drug. Is it a gateway drug for every single person? No. But we're not talking about those people. We're talking about the people for whom it is a gateway drug to many other substance addictions.
Definitely doing a show about this. One more comment from the audience, and then we're going to go into a quick musical break. Go ahead.
All right, well, what I was going to add to the
Your name, please, sir.
I'm sorry, my name is Lateef Gibson.
Thank you, sir.
And what I was going to add to the conversation was, it's one thing of saying a gateway drug, but the whole thing, that line is very blurry. It's very gray. And I say that because here it is, you have individuals that's purchasing marijuana that might be laced with another type of drug. And if it's laced with another type of drug that is known to be a little more addictive than that which is marijuana, and they thinking they're only getting marijuana, they're gonna continue to go for that drug that they got. And when they get like some real marijuana with no lace, then guess what? They're not gonna get that same high that they received before. So they're gonna go ahead and chase after something that's a little more addictive. And so right there, when we saying the gateway, we gotta look at it. Is it pure, or is it mixed with something else? Furthermore, the other thing that I have to say dealing with the whole thing is that we as individuals, our bodies are different. The chemical makeup of our bodies is the same, but we're different. And so we react to drugs in different ways. Just like, you know, that which you may be allergic to, I may not be allergic to. And so we can't sit here and say that this bit of drug right here is gonna react to my body the same way as the next person.
A great conversation we are having. Hampton Rose Voices, a very special episode entitled War on Drugs, who's winning. We're going to take a quick break, and when we return, we're going to get quickly into the opioid. No, I'm tripping. We're going to get into treatment. We're done talking about that stuff. Treatment, how to treat drug addiction, okay? So one song, and then we'll be back. It's Hot 91. I don't know how we're going to do that in 2 minutes, but we're going to do it. Treatment, okay? I do want to say that we do have the SAMHSA's national helpline. It is free and confidential. It's 24/7, 365 a year. Treatment referral and information service is both in English and Spanish for individuals and families facing mental and or substance use disorders. Call this number, 1-800-662-HELP, 1-800-662-4357. What does treatment consist of? So if you go get treatment for drug addiction or drug abuse, what does that treatment look like? Dr. Ross?
Okay, so I represent the GHR Recovery Center. We have a website, www.treatmentva.com. If you know someone who has an opioid problem or a crack problem, please call us because we really do want to help the community. And again, it's a free service for those who have Medicaid. So the ASAM, which is the American Society of Addiction Medicine, came up with a multi-dimensional understanding of treatment. And this multi-dimensional understanding involves 6 components. The first component is the degree of intoxication or withdrawal potential. The second component is biomedical conditions. So what you want to look at, and this is called a co-occurring condition. Thank you. A co-occurring condition. So what are relevant biomedical conditions? Diabetes, HIV, pregnancy, hepatitis, infectious diseases. Because if people have these things, it makes treatment more difficult. So we have to treat those things as well as the substance abuse. The third dimension has to do with mental health issues. So if someone is psychotic, hearing things and seeing things, if someone is very depressed, if someone is bipolar, et cetera, these things also impact substance abuse treatment. So that has to be treated as well. The fourth thing is readiness to change. Is somebody denying that they have an addiction? Is someone ambivalent about getting help? Does someone actively want to get help? That's another important component that impacts the relapse rate. And then the fifth dimension is relapse prevention. Are we aware of the triggers that maintain the drug addiction? Do we have mechanisms to deal with stress? Do we have are we able to utilize the tools and skills that we've acquired? And finally, the last dimension has to do with the living environment. Do we have a supportive family who wants us to stay clean? Do we have supportive coworkers? Do we have adequate housing? Do we have adequate occupation? So these six criteria come together to form the core of treatment. Not only the core of treatment, but also the level of treatment. Because if you are very depressed, you might need to go to a higher level of treatment. So these things that ASAM has pointed out allow us to create a very specific treatment plan for all the people, along with medication-assisted treatment, such as Suboxone treatment. And so what we do at GHR is we have an internist who does a history and physical on every single patient and who does the relevant medical screenings. We have a psychiatrist who deals with the psychiatric issues with medication, antidepressants, antipsychotics. And then we have a very, very robust mental health and mental health and a substance abuse component. So we have individual therapy, we have family therapy, we have group therapy for both the mental health side of the house and the substance abuse side of the house. And article after article has shown that this type of robust treatment that deals with the medical, the psychiatric, and the substance abuse is what is helpful. Finally, to address your last question, there is no limit that we place on the amount of treatment someone can receive. Treatment is no longer program-driven, where you get 12 weeks. Treatment is now client-driven. What the client needs is what you provide. And even when they're clean and sober and not using for a while, we have a very strong aftercare component. So people can come back once a week, once every 2 weeks, once every 3 weeks, to do individual, to do group, to do family, whatever they need. And when you put all these components together, this is what significantly reduces relapse with regard to addiction.
Thank you, and I'm not going to hold you guys. I know we're kind of 3 minutes over 7, but treatment is very important if you are struggling or if someone that you know is struggling and facing substance abuse, mental disorders. 1-800-662-HELP, 1-800-4357. Last point, last question. For the loved ones who have those who are addicted to drugs, I'm sure they feel helpless at times. So if anyone has any pointers, what can the loved one of a drug abuser or a drug addict do to help? How can they contribute towards the treatment of the affected?
When you say loved ones, one thing that we tend to see in treatment programs such as drug courts as well as many others is, unfortunately, you also get a view of what the family system is like. And oftentimes, the person who is in treatment is not the first generation who is suffering with addiction. So it is certainly important for families overall to know that the programs that their loved one is participating in supports them, is to give them opportunities to either join in with therapy as well as to participate in education and learning more and more about what their loved one is going through while they're in treatment, as well as what to expect along the road of recovery. That's the short version.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Newby. I really want to say kudos to us. We had a really great conversation on today. Yes, go ahead and put your hands together. What a great conversation we had. And thank you, because I have to plan shows in advance, so I got like 3 shows in my head for May. Praise the Lord. I want to thank everybody who came out today. Thank you so much. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you for those who are listening. Those who are in our studio audience, we do have a reception after this. So for your participation, you get treated by Hot 91. I want to thank our panelists. Listen, it is Friday night, and you could be anywhere. You could be anywhere, but you answered a poor little associate producer's call via email, and I sounded stressed and pressed, and you guys came through, so thank you so much. Dr. Robert Perkins, Chair of Norfolk State University Sociology Department Community Activist. Delegate Stephen Heretic, 79th District in the Virginia House of Delegates. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Lawrence Ross from the GHR Center. Dr. Marla Newby from the Norfolk Circuit Court. Thank you. Investigator Dan Love, thank you for being here. Lieutenant Michelle Naughton, she had to go. And also Corporal William Pickering, all from the Norfolk Police Department. Thank you guys for being here. And thank you for listening. Make sure you keep it locked. It is Hot 91.